Welcome to Topic 6 of the CSS full course, CSS Functions. CSS functions are a powerful tool for creating dynamic and maintainable styles in web design. In this topic, we'll explore how to establish CSS variables and perform dynamic calculations, which help us create more flexible and efficient CSS. Let's begin by learning how to define reusable values for your styles using CSS variables. We'll be discussing how to set CSS variables and the root pseudo class. So what are CSS variables? CSS variables allow us to store values to make it easier to maintain consistency and more easily make global style changes. CSS variables are also known as custom properties. So let's first look at defining a variable. We do it like this, where the variable is set using double dashes. We then have the variable name, in this case primary, which is for a primary color, and this text can be whatever you want. And then we have our stored value, in this case a hex code. So there's defining a variable, and we also need to know about how to use a variable in our code. It's very simple and it's done like this. We have our property, in this case background color, and then we use this variable function, which is the word var with an opening bracket and closing bracket. And inside the brackets, we put our variable, in this case primary. So CSS variables are first defined and then used inside the variable function. So let's go and see these variables being used on some popular web applications. I'm on the Notion homepage. I'm going to open up DevTools and I'll select the heading. You'll see over here we have color with the var function with the variable name black 800 being used. For another example, I'm going to click the button over here and we can see letter spacing again with the variable function and a variable inside of it. So these are examples of the variable being used with the property. But where are these variables being defined? If I scroll down, all these variables are being defined over here on this root pseudo class. You can see all the different variables and the properties. Over here, we can see a whole bunch of colors being defined, and over here, a bunch of different spacing. So what is this root pseudo class? So CSS variables are set on the root pseudo class. We just saw it looks like this, where in red, we have the root pseudo class. And then inside the root pseudo class, we define our variables. And as we've just seen, we then use our variables with the variable function. So the variable can be used in multiple locations. So what is the root pseudo class? It's a special pseudo class selector that matches the root element in a document's hierarchy. The root HTML element looks like this, where we select the HTML tag, and this is basically the same thing. That is the root pseudo class and the HTML type selector. But it is best practice to use the root pseudo class to define your variables. Now there is a slight technical difference which makes the root pseudo class more versatile, but won't make any practical difference in our project. So we're going to be using the root pseudo class, but you could use the HTML root element. It is just better practice to use the root pseudo class. I know when I first learned this, I was seriously thrown off by this new root pseudo class. Honestly, don't worry about it. Just think of it as the HTML root element, and for the purpose of defining variables, it just has a bit more versatility for more complicated projects. So let's go play around with variables inside VS Code. I've got this new index.html file, and I've linked a style sheet which is currently empty. I'm going to go add an anchor tag. For the href value, I'm just going to point it to Google, and I'm going to put the text back here. I'll give it a class of btn. I'm then going to add a div. I'm going to give it a class of card. And inside the div, I'm going to put an h1 and put the text welcome. In app.css, let's go select the button. I'm going to give it a teal background color with this hex code. I'm going to give it some padding of 20 pixels top and bottom and 40 pixels left and right. I'll give some margin bottom of 50 pixels. We'll change this display property to inline block. For the color, we'll give it this gray value. And for the font size, we'll give it 20 pixels. Let's then select the card. I'm going to give it the same background color as what we defined on the button. I'm going to give it a width of 800 pixels and a height of 400 pixels. Finally, I'll select the H1. Let's give it a font size of 50 pixels. And we'll make it the same gray color as used in our button. Okay, so let's check this out in the browser. So as you can see, we have our button. There's some margin at the bottom of 50 pixels, and we have our teal card with an H1 saying welcome. Now, as you can see, we have some repeated values here. For example, this teal color, as well as the gray color on the button and on the H1. As you can imagine, in a large working web application, some properties are going to be repeated a lot, like color. So let's go and use CSS variables to define them in one place. I'm going to come right to the top. I'm going to select the root element pseudo class, which we discussed earlier, and I'm going to define all my variables inside here. Let's define a primary color. So I'm doing -- primary, and I'm going to store this teal value. Let's define a gray color, -- gray, which will be this value over here. Now we can store any value we want. These are color values, but let's go store some CSS units. I'll create a new variable called text-lg to represent large text, and I'm going to give this a value of 50 pixels. It's what we're using in our H1 over here. Let's go do another pixel value. I'll do -- text sm for small, and this value will be 20 pixels. So here we've defined all our variables. Let's now go use them inside the CSS. I'm going to update every place I have this teal color with the variable function, open brackets, and then I'll put in the variable, -- primary. I'm just going to copy this and paste it on the card background color as well. For the color property, let's go use the CSS variable there, which is -- gray. I'll copy this, remove the color of the H1 here, and replace it with the variable. For the font size of 20 pixels, let's go add the variable function and put our text small variable. For the font size over here, let's go remove 50 pixels, put our variable function, and grab the text large variable. So I'm going to refresh, and you'll see there's no changes. But we're now using our variables inside our CSS. And the really magical thing about variables is that the values are defined once. So if I wanted to go update my primary color, instead of updating it twice, or as you can imagine in a much larger project, hundreds of times, I'd just come to the primary variable here and change the value. Let's make it this purple color. I'll refresh, and you'll see now, wherever that variable is being used, the color changes. Now, I mentioned earlier that the root pseudo class is better practice over the HTML root element, but just to show you it does work, for a simple use case like this, if I save and refresh, you'll see there's no changes. However, as I've mentioned, it's just better practice to use the root pseudo class. So let's finish up by starting to build out the next summary card, CSS functions. We looked at CSS variables, where for defining a variable, it looked like this, where we use double dashes and a variable name which we choose. We then give it a stored value, in this case a color, but we saw you can put any kind of values, like units as well. For using a variable, we did it like this, where we have our CSS property, like background color, and then we use the variable function and put inside the brackets our variable. We also learnt about the root pseudo class, where CSS variables are set on the root pseudo class. The root pseudo class looks like this, and it's where we define all our CSS variables. So let's jump into VS Code and add CSS variables to our project. The first thing I'd like to do is highlight some areas where it would be useful to have a variable because the value is being repeated several times. You can see, for example, on our button, we're using our primary blue background color. And on our secondary button, we're using the secondary purple background color. We're also using these colors in our highlights. And inside the CTA section, on our card, we're also using this primary color. So if we ever wanted to later update our primary color, we'd have to go to all these locations and update it. But with the power of CSS variables, we can just define it once and just update the value on the variable, which would change all these different color values we just looked at. So I'm going to scroll right to the top, and I'm going to essentially work through our style guide at the top here and pick different property values we should convert to variables. The first values I want to put as variables are our different font sizes. So we're going to scroll down. We're going to go add the root pseudo class, and I place this right at the top above all the other selectors, as we want our variables to always load in first. I'll add a comment and put font size, and I'm going to define my font sizes like this, -- text. For the small text, I'm going to go -sm for small and give it the value 12 pixels. The next value was 16 pixels. We're using this as our base unit, so I'm going to put that as base and put 16 pixels. The next value, 20 pixels, we're using for paragraphs. So for this project, I'm just going to put -- text paragraph 20 pixels. I'm then going to put the rest of these as each of our headings. So -- text h5 with the value of 24 pixels. And just to avoid boring you, I'm going to go put the others in now. Okay, so I've added in all our font sizes as variables. Now I'm defining it like this, but it's also common to define your font sizes with notation like this, where SM is small. You could leave this as base. You could put this as MD instead of paragraph, MD standing for medium. This would then be L for large. This would then be XL for extra large. And then you would do 2XL, 3XL, 4XL, etc. That is another notation system, which is quite popular. But just for the sake of this project, I want to keep our font size variable names very specific, just so it's clear exactly what they are. The next values I want to define are our font weights. So we'll pop down here, add a new comment, font weights. I'll do -- font weight normal, which is just 400, and then -- font weight bold, which is 700. The next value is line heights. So I'll add a new comment, line heights. I'll define the variable line height tight, which will be 1.2, and line height normal, which will be 1.5. The next values is letter spacing. So let's go add letter spacing as a comment. I'll add a variable letter spacing tight, which is -2 pixels. I'm not going to define a variable for 0 because we don't actually use it anywhere in our project. So there's no need to define a variable there. Next up is font family. So I'll add a comment, font family. I'll create a new variable, font-family. And I'm just going to grab the value we're using in our project down here. So I'll copy that and paste it there. All right, back to our style guide. So we've looked at these properties. Let's go add our colors now. So scrolling back down, I'll add a comment, colors. We'll start with our primary color. I'm just going to copy the comment for easy access. I'll define a variable primary base. I'll copy that value there. Next, I'll define primary tint, and I'll copy this value here. And for the last primary value, I'll define primary shade and copy this value here. All right, just to avoid boring you, I'm going to go add in all the different variables for all our different colors. All right, so I've gone and added in variables for our different secondary colors, our different tertiary colors, our different gray colors, and white and black. So let's see what else is left in the style guide. We have border radius and our spacing system. Now, you can go and add these as variables. So for example, you could define a variable space 5, space 10, space 15, space 20, etc. For the purpose of this project, it's a bit overkill, and I'd prefer just to work with the actual units inside the project. For things like margin, the value we're going to be using is specific to the design we wish to achieve, so it's not likely you'd ever want to update those variables. So you can define these variables like border radius and space sizing. I'm just not going to. What I will say though, is that we should still use the values defined in our style guide. So we should continue to use these spacing values, and we should continue to use these border radius values. And if we come and add any more border radius values later, we need to add them into the style guide. So we still have one place where we know all our values. All right, so let's go ahead and use these values in our project. So we're going to scroll from the top of our document to the bottom and just update any values that now need a variable. The first one over here is font family. We define the variable -- font family, and you can see VS Code is able to pick it up. We also define the font weight. So I'm going to grab the variable -- font weight normal. For the line height of 1.5, we define this as line height normal. So let's get the variable -- line height normal. And this gray color is our gray base color. So let's go grab a variable -- gray base. Scrolling down, we can update the font weight of all our headings. So grabbing the variable, this was font weight bold. The line height, we defined it as line weight tight. So we'll grab the variable -- line height tight. For letter spacing, we defined this as letter spacing tight. So variable -- letter spacing tight. And the color for our headings was the gray shade. So variable -- gray shade. All right, I just realized I've just misspelled this. So let me just go update that. So this should be shade. And just making sure to update this here, shade. Now for our headings, we're actually working in rems. So I don't want the variables to be in pixels. So let me just go update those to 1.2 rem, 1.6 rem. And just to avoid boring you, I'm going to do the rest. Okay, so these are updated from pixels to rems. Let's go use them now. So for the font size, I'm going to use the variable text h1. Over here, it's the variable text h2. And just to avoid boring you, I'm going to update the remaining headings and paragraph. Okay, so I've updated all our headings to now use variables. For the anchor tag, I also need to update this, the variable text base. Scrolling down, I also need to update the font size of our small text. This was the variable text small. The font size on our button, we need to update to text base. The padding and border radius we're going to leave. The colors we're now going to come and update. For the background color, we're using primary base, which is the same over here. For the color of the text, we can also update this to white. For the hover and active states, I'm going to update the white there. This blue is the primary shade. So variable, primary shade. And it's the same value being used in the border here. So let's update that to primary shade. For the outline button, this is our base primary color. So I'll update that. And I'll update the border color. We'll change this white to our variable. That's our primary blue color. So let's copy this variable here, add it there, and add it here. Let's also update the white. For the hover and active pseudo class, we're using the shade. So I'll cut this and paste in the variable, and cut this and paste in the variable, as well as update the white. For the secondary button, let's just straight away update the white over here and over here. This is our secondary base. So let's remove this, grab the variable, secondary base. I'll copy that and update this value here. On the hover and active pseudo class, this color value is our secondary shade. So let's remove that, grab variable, secondary shade. We'll copy that and update the value here. Scrolling down to our highlight, the color white will update with the variable. Padding and border radius we leave. And these are just the different base colors for primary, secondary, and tertiary. So let's remove that, grab our primary base, remove this, add our secondary base, and remove this, and add our tertiary base. Scrolling down, so that covers us for all the components. Let's scroll down to the different sections. Now for most of the sections, there's not going to be that many variables to update, because a lot of this is dealing with box model properties, like widths, heights, padding, and margin, and we haven't defined any variables for those. So let's go and see what we need to update. So scrolling down, there's nothing here. It's all margins and widths. Scrolling down. Okay, so the only value we need to update is on the CTA card, the background color. So let's go remove this and grab our primary base color. All right, so I know that was a little bit boring, but our project is now in a much better state, where we're using variables which are defined once in our project. So let's check this out in the browser. Okay, so as you may expect, there's actually been no changes. And that's because all we've done is update the values that were used in the CSS to variables. But check this out now. If I go to our primary base, let's go change this to a totally different color, like this green. Let's update our secondary base color to also something totally different, like this pink. And let's update our tertiary base to this turquoisey color. So I'll save and refresh. And you can see now, with just a few updates, our entire color palette has changed. Now this obviously looks horrible, but I just wanted to show you the power of using variables. All right, let me just change those back. Next up, we'll explore how to perform dynamic computations directly in your styles with CSS Calculations. We'll be discussing how to perform calculations and calculations in variables. So what are CSS calculations? We can perform dynamic calculations when setting values. And it looks like this. We use a calc function, which has similar syntax to the variable function we saw earlier, but instead of var, it's calc for calc. And inside the parentheses, we can perform calculations. In this case, we're using mixed units. We're dividing 100% by 3 and minusing 50 pixels. So let's play around with this inside VS Code. So as always, I've got an index.html file with the boilerplate, and I've linked a style sheet which is currently empty. I'm going to go add an image tag, and I've just grabbed this image of the city of Sydney for the source attribute. For the alt text, I'll just put Sydney. So let's check this out in the browser. So as expected, we just have an image of Sydney Harbour. And as you can see, it's absolutely massive because its width and height is just the size of the source file of the image. Let's head over to app.css. I'm going to select the image, and I'm just going to add a width of 100%. I'll refresh, and because this is a standalone image, the parent container is the body, and setting width 100% causes the image to fit nicely inside the body and adjusts depending on the width of the browser. I'm going to head back to index.html. I'm going to copy this image tag, and I'm just going to paste it twice. I'll refresh, and now we have 3 images of Sydney Harbour. Now, what I'd like to do is have these images next to each other. So what I could do is update this width, use a calculation, add 100% divided by 3, and then just to show you the use of mixed units, I'm also just going to subtract 50 pixels of the width of each image. So let's refresh, and now you can see the width of the image is 100% divided 3, which essentially splits the current width of the browser divided by 3, and then we're subtracting 50 pixels. Now, just as a note, this is not how you actually want to put images next to each other. We'll be learning a lot more about layouts in the Flexbox and CSS grid topic. All I wanted to show you is how you can use CSS calculations to set properties like width, and how you can use mixed units like percentages and pixels. So let's now move on to variables and calculations. It is common to use variable and calculations in combination. For example, we just saw earlier, we can set variables with the root pseudo class, and you can see here, we have the text h1 variable, which has a value of 50 pixels. Inside our CSS, we could then select the h1 and do something like this, where we use the calculation function, we put in our variable, in this case 50 pixels, and we can then perform a calculation like adding on 10 view widths. In this case, what this is essentially doing is setting an initial font size of 50 pixels, and then depending on the width of the browser, the font size will scale. So let's check this out inside VS Code. I've gone ahead and added an h1 to our markup with the text welcome, and in app.css, I've just added what we just saw. We're selecting the root pseudo class, we're defining a variable text h1, and setting it to 50 pixels. We're then selecting the h1, giving it a font size, and for the font size, we're using a calculation where we use the variable text h1, which is 50 pixels, and then we add on 10 view widths. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see the text is pretty big, but as I reduce the width of the browser, you can see it's reducing, and that's because a calculation is being performed. 10VW is effectively reducing as I reduce the width of the browser. And if we open up DevTools, if I go to the Computed tab, I'll select the h1. You can see font size is currently 434 pixels. And as I reduce the width of the browser, you can see the font size is dynamically changing. So let's finish off our summary card, CSS functions. We looked at CSS calculations. A CSS calculation is a function that looks like this, where we use the word calc and parentheses to give us the calc function. We also saw we could use mixed units, like percentages and pixels. Alright, so let's go and use CSS calculations inside our Quill project. So let's first discuss what we're going to be doing. I'm going to scroll down to our header section. Earlier on in the course, in the CSS units topic, we set our header, which includes the navbar and hero section. Looking at that in the HTML, you can see our header includes the nav and the hero section. We set that to a height of 100 view heights to ensure that content always remained above the fold. Now, I mentioned at that point, we're not really going to see the effect of this until we get up to the Flexbox topic. But what I'd like to do now is use CSS calculations to improve how we've set this up so we can start to see the effect of using 100 view heights. What I'm going to do is go up to our variables. I'm going to add a new comment. I'm going to paste in miscellaneous. I'm terrible at spelling this word, so before this video, I had it in my clipboard to make sure to spell correctly. Under here, we can go add miscellaneous or other kinds of variables. I'm going to define a variable called nav height, and I'm going to set this value now at 300 pixels. Now this value, we are going to come and update later. It's going to be too big for now, and only when we get to the Flexbox topic will our navigation items, like the logo and anchor tags, be in a better layout. Now the reason we want to define a navigation height is because it's a value that will be used throughout the application, across many different pages. So defining a navigation height as a variable is a good idea. So let's now scroll down to our header section. What I'm going to do for now is just comment this out. We are soon going to remove it and do a better implementation of this. I do just want to keep these values here for now. Inside our navbar, I'm now going to go give this the height property, and I'm going to grab the variable nav height. So essentially, we're fixing our navigation height at 300 pixels, which is the value defined on our nav height variable. In our hero section, I'm now going to go set a height. I'm going to use our calculation function. I'm going to initially set this at 100 view heights. But if you think about it, because we've defined a fixed height on our navigation bar, we now need to deduct that from the height of our hero section. That way, both the navigation bar and the hero section will always be above the fold. So I'm going to go minus, grab our variable, and grab the nav height. So what I've effectively done is from the header over here, I've split this height into two. In the nav bar, I'm setting the height using the nav height variable. And in the hero section, I'm setting the height to 100 view heights and then just deducting off the nav height. I also just need to add the min height onto our hero section. So now I'm going to completely remove this. And I'm just going to go remove the class inside the HTML, as we don't need that now. Now, before we check this out in the browser, just so we can really see what's going on here, I'm going to go add a background color of light blue. And on the hero section, I'll add a background color of light coral. I'm going to come and remove these later, but this will just help us see what's going on. So let's check this out in the browser. Okay, there's quite a bit going on here. First of all, you can see our navigation bar now has a height of 300 pixels. Let's confirm that in DevTools. You can see from the CSS box model, the navigation height is 300 pixels. As I mentioned, I've just made it quite a bit bigger for now. We are going to come and change this value later in the flexbox topic. We can see we have some white gap here, and that's being defined by this margin bottom. For now, I'm just going to remove it, as we don't really need it right now. I'll refresh, and you'll see now our hero section and navigation bar are touching. I'm going to slightly scroll up the height of the browser, and you can see this is not working how we want it to. It should be that when I scroll down, I no longer see hero section. You can see as I scroll down, the hero section goes on for quite a while. Now this is being caused by the minimum height of 800 pixels. It's currently just too big. So I'm going to come and reduce this down to 400 pixels. I'll refresh, and you'll see when I scroll now, it is behaving how we want it to. It's being cut right at the bottom of the browser, and when I scroll, you can see we're now moving below the fold. Just to confirm this works nicely, if I reduce the height of the browser, the hero section still has a minimum height of 400 pixels. So all the content is still within the hero section. Now the next problem we have is that when I scroll down, there's this big white space here. And that's being set by this large margin bottom of 30 rems. I'm just going to update this to 10 rems in order to reduce it. And you'll see this looks a lot better. So let me extend the browser the full height of my screen. I'll refresh. And if I scroll down now, you'll see this is behaving exactly how we want it to. All the content is above the fold. And as soon as I scroll down, we're on to the next section. I'm going to reduce the height of the browser slightly, and you'll see it's the same effect. I'll scroll down, and we move on to the next section. So just to recap what we've done, because I know it seems a bit confusing. We've effectively set a fixed height on our navigation bar, which at the moment I've set quite large, and we are going to change later. And then I'm using a CSS calculation to set the height of the hero section so that it always remains above the fold. We're using 100 view heights, and we're minusing off the navigation height. And this gives us a really nice effect, where the navigation bar and hero section are always above the fold. And just to reiterate, the minimum height ensures that even when the height goes too small, the hero section still has a minimum height, as you can see in the coral color. Now, this is kind of a halfway implementation. Hopefully you can see we're using the view height units and calculations pretty effectively. But I do just want to highlight that the full implementation will be covered in the Flexbox topic. Just to finish off, I'm going to remove these background colors, as they were there just for demonstration purposes. The last thing I want to do is just scroll up to our nav height variable. I'm just going to pop a comment next to it to remind myself to update the value in the Flexbox topic. That's CSS functions complete. Great work for sticking with me so far. In the next topic, we'll dive into my favorite part of CSS, Flexbox, which is a powerful technique that enables us to create flexible and responsive layouts. Also make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay in the loop with new releases. See you in the next video.